All right. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my PhD research. Right now we're kind of right in the thick of it, so this will be kind of a brief whirlwind overview of everything that's going on. Be a little bit light on the results, but maybe give you a little taste for what's coming up. So just as a quick background, as I'm sure a lot of you all know, the neotropics are very biodiverse in general, and bird diversity for the world actually peaks in northern South America. And my research is in Costa Rica, which is right up here, kind of right where it's starting to get fun. So 894 bird species have been recorded in Costa Rica, which is pretty high up there. It's all right. But very few of these species have actually been studied in great detail, so there's a lot of room for research. And in addition to just kind of understanding what the habitat requirements are for a lot of these species, it's really important to understand how they move between suitable habitat in terms of conservation, because some species are much more tolerant for moving across non-habitat areas than others, and that kind of spatial arrangement is really important if you're trying to kind of plan out what to protect or to restore. And in Costa Rica, this is particularly salient, as it is in much of the neotropics, because landscape change has been one of the driving forces in the region. Between the 1950s and 1980s, Costa Rica lost 2/3 of its forest cover, as you can see from these maps, primarily for the expansion of agriculture. And as I'm sure a lot of you know from intro bio, fragmentation has adverse effects on species. And one thing that's kind of interesting to think about is the fact that this landscape change is both driven by economic opportunities, but it also influences economic opportunities, especially in Costa Rica, where you now have, in the past couple decades, there's been a big trend towards conservation and towards kind of restoring a lot of this forest. The land cover present actually is very influential in terms of people's economic opportunities, not just for cattle or coffee, but also for tourism. So that kind of whole pattern is driving economics and driving the whole kind of land use patterns, as well as being influenced by them. So as Costa Rica is kind of moving into this new trend of restoring forest, as conservation goes, it's really important. Most of this has happened sort of haphazardly and unplanned, and what we need to know is how species are actually using this so that some of these efforts can be better targeted to the needs of the specific species. So the objectives for my research are to identify environmental conditions that predict the presence of different bird species. Birds are what we're using for this project because birds are really great indicators of ecosystem quality in general. So we're kind of sticking with that. We also want to analyze the movement patterns and habitat use of these species to see how they're moving between patches of habitat, and then assess the relationship between forest fragmentation and stakeholder perceptions of conservation to see how some of that's feeding back off of each other, and then use all of this data to inform real-life conservation planning and project effects of land use decisions. So our study area is in northwestern Costa Rica in the Upper Guatemala watershed, which includes famous Monteverde Cloud Forest Reserve. And so in order to select study sites, what we did is we took a whole bunch of landscape metrics, and then we basically chunked the landscape up into 10 different strata and used that to just kind of spatially stratify our sampling, make sure we're capturing the full range of a bunch of these different environmental gradients. And then we set up random sampling points within each of those strata. To get into the methods, so the first thing that we want to do is to determine which species are present where and kind of what landscape gradients are predicting those species' presence. So for this, what we're doing is we're actually using two methods in conjunction, point counts and misnetting. We're doing both of these because they're both kind of biased towards different groups of birds. Point counts are really effective for counting some of the charismatic, canopy frugivores, things like toucans and parrots that are real flashy, but often don't come down low a lot. Whereas misnetting can sometimes be much more beneficial for capturing data on some of the more like understory insectivores that are a lot more cryptic. You don't necessarily see them as much, but they tend to hit the nets a whole lot more. So by doing both of these methods, we're able to get like a better kind of comprehensive understanding of which species are in which areas. So for the point counts, what we do is we do 10-minute counts at each location with 2 observers, and you detect birds both visually and orally. So you count everything that you see and hear. And with the mist netting, we actually set up these nets and we capture the birds in the nets. We take a bunch of measurements, and then we'll release the birds back into the wild. And so far, our results for occupancy, we've hit a whole bunch of different sites. Still need to work on some of that, but making some progress. We've recorded 3,035 total individuals and 170 different species, which is pretty cool. And you can see a nice frequency distribution. There's some species that we see a whole lot of, like long-tailed manakins, and the national bird of Costa Rica, the clay-colored thrush. There's other species like turquoise-browed motmots that we see a whole lot fewer of. And all of this will be used to develop species distribution models for each of these species, as well as kind of general like richness models, and even kind of maybe taking some key indicator species in groups and maybe using that to predict out quality of some of these ecosystems. And then getting on to the next part of the study, which is actually looking at the movement. So for this, we're going to focus on 2 bird species, blue diadem motmots and blue-throated toucanets. We chose these because they're both primarily frugivorous. They're both forest dependent. They're both medium-sized, and they're both residents, but they're hypothesized to have different fragmentation tolerances. Toucanets should be much more tolerant of fragmentation than the motmots. And for both of them, when we catch them in the mist nets, we attach this little 3-gram GPS transmitter to them, and it will record the bird's location every 5 minutes during 2-hour windows that we have it on each day. And so far, we're kind of just getting started on that, but we've gotten them out on 5 motmots and 2 toucanets. We've gotten some locations back. This is an example from 1 motmot. And we're using that to develop home ranges and calculate like differences between species of home range size as well as within species in kind of more or less fragmented landscapes to see how that changes the home range, and then quantify the land cover and analyze movement paths. And then all of this will be used to inform an individual-based model, or IBM, which will allow us to parameterize model birds and see how they will change in behavior based on how we're kind of changing an experimental landscape. And that's really helpful because it allows us to kind of do these large-scale sort of experiments that we could never actually conduct like in the real world. And then finally, what we're just kind of getting started on is doing a participatory mapping component and interview component for the social part of this research. And in this, one of the main things is we're gonna have participants which include local landowners, especially like a lot of farm owners, as well as key personnel in local government and non-government organizations. So people like that might be directors of a reserve, as well as people that might be the directors of like a power company and stuff. So a whole bunch of different actors in the region. And we're gonna sit down with them and have them identify places on a map that they think are important for conservation, as well as places where they have preferences for like other management types. And then talk about kind of in general, different preferences that they have for the region and where those are located. And one thing that I'm really interested in is kind of trying to determine like, because there's a lot of talk about how conservation is so important in Costa Rica, and I think most people in general accept a lot of that, but within this landscape especially, I want to see if conservation is kind of something that happens over there. So we have in this orange area some really like famous, well-renowned reserves that are super well protected, and I think a lot of people identify with that, and there's a lot of kind of conservation ethos towards that area. But as you kind of move down this fragmentation gradient in the study area, I want to see how people in those areas perceive conservation? Is it something that they're locating kind of in their own backyard, or is it something that they're kind of aware of, but they think it all should be happening up in this already well-protected area? Because this really fragmented area is probably actually a lot more critical at this juncture for protecting a lot of these bird species. The well-protected area is well-protected. This also kind of moves down an elevational gradient. So we actually have a narrow band here towards the bottom of our study area that you kind of have some different species composition, and throughout Costa Rica, that kind of ecosystem is not well protected. And another thing that I really want to look at, because there's a lot of debate sort of in the more like conservation biology community, is whether we use like certain charismatic species to drive like conservation and like put forth like, oh, the quetzal or bellbird or something that everyone identifies with, and use that to protect the rest of the ecosystem, or a more like community-based approach, which is what a lot of biologists are now kind of fighting for. Is we don't really want to promote this charismatic species. We want to promote protecting this whole community, and sometimes these charismatic species aren't maybe good representatives of some of the ecosystems that are most threatened, which is kind of the case here. Is a lot of the iconic species are again present only in this already well-protected zone. And if you're focusing only on them, you're going to miss out on a lot of other critical species. So I want to talk with people in these interviews about kind of what they're identifying the conservation with. Is it very much like conservation is associated with these few birds, or is conservation associated with the birds in my backyard that might be very different from that? And just kind of looking at how patterns of land use and stuff, and the economics that come with that, are affecting people's decisions. People that are in the tourism industry are going to already live up near the top in that orange area, and so they're going to be a lot more influenced to kind of have this conservation ethos than people that are large-scale farmers down near the bottom of the study area. So kind of looking at how like human actions have shaped this kind of fragmentation gradient, but then how that like landscape that's been altered then plays back into the economic opportunities that kind of then goes back into shaping people's already sort of somewhat formulated views on conservation. So we'll kind of tease a lot of that out. Broader impacts are providing greater insight into behavioral traits of poorly studied species, predicting how landscape change will affect these species, and then identifying links between landscape structure and stakeholder views on conservation. And I'd like to acknowledge my advisor, Nate Niblink, and my committee members, Nate Lab colleagues, whole bunch of funding sources that have generously given to us. A whole bunch of people that have helped me out in the field and have been really great. And open up for some questions.
Yep, we got time for a couple questions. What's your favorite bird?
It changes every day. Yes?
I was just wondering if your participatory information could be fed back, then, and maybe I missed it, to your IBMs, or is there a way to integrate?
I would like to. I'm still kind of figuring out exactly how to make that work, but the goal is to kind of try to turn it into something that then can be used in the IBM. Definitely the cool thing about the IBM is like we could actually program in like real life scenarios. Like we can make like model landscapes, but we also can make a real landscape. And if someone was thinking about like restoring a certain area or cutting a certain area, we could look at like how that would theoretically like directly affect those species. But it would be cool if we could kind of try to maybe come up with some sort of gradient on like different views and program that in almost as a background layer in the IBM and see how that might, I don't know, play into landscape.
That former thing that you mentioned, showing, for example, as a landowner, how as you change the landscape, it could change the community composition. It would be fun just to have that on a portable thing you can show a landowner, because I bet many of them would be very receptive.
That's a really cool idea. Yeah.
even if it wasn't 100% tailored to their.
That's really cool. I like that a lot.
Well, we have to move on, but I'm sure you can find Cody afterwards. So let's thank him again and